Okay. Testing, testing, testing. Let's see if it's working. Here's my favorite part where we do a sound check and we get the infinity loop. It's horrible. Okay, let's see. Here's my favorite part where we do a sound check and we get the infinity loop. It's horrible. Ooh, there it is. Okay, let's see. Here's my favorite part where we do a sound check and we get the infinity loop. It's horrible. Did you hear the infinity loops? All right, sounds like we're good to go. Okay, sound check's done. Everything looks good. If you guys are just joining us, which it looks like I'm the only viewer, so that's not a good sign. But anyways, you know the drill. This is the awkward part where you watch me troubleshoot and sound check before we get started. So enjoy my derpy face, and I will kind of check back in with you in a few minutes. It varies from week to week. So like the normal ones, sometimes we get, upwards of 40, 50. A lot of people watch the replays too. So like if this records and then it will get recorded onto our website and then they can retroactively watch it if they missed it. So we get a lot of the replays too. So
you're charging for that?
It's a monthly subscription. So it's like $20 a month and they get to, we got a whole bunch of recipes, forums, videos, and then Mike and I do live Q&A every week. It's pretty cool. Mm-hmm. Oh, we're up to 2 viewers. One of them doesn't count because one of them is actually me. So we're just hanging out. We're going to probably get started around 6:30. 6:30, that's my time. So that'll be 9:30 if you're on the East Coast and 8:30 if you're in Central Time. So we're just twiddling our thumbs for a few minutes before we get started. In the meantime, grab a snack, grab something to drink, and you can load up the questions that I'm answering today on the red link under my big, handsome face. So if you look under the check out these questions, there's a red link that says 9-1417. Those are the forum questions that I'll be answering for tonight. So you can get those preloaded up so you see what I'm answering and grab a snack, grab a beer. I've got my beer. I'm ready to go. Okay, everything looks good. Excuse me. Okay, I got my questions all loaded up. Okay. Everything looks good. Do one more sound check while we're waiting here. Okay. Everything looks good. Do one more sound check while we're waiting here. Sound looks good. Or sounds good, I should say. Man, so many questions. Which one am I going to tackle first tonight? I wish I could see who the other viewers are. That would be funny. So like on my portal screen here, I can see like how many viewers, and I can see myself, but I can't see who else is here. So I wish there was a way I could click on it and then I could call you out and be like, hey, are you paying attention? At the moment, I can't quite do that. That would be pretty hilarious. Ooh. There it is, off to a good start.
Can they hear you right now?
Mm-hmm. All right, so I think what I'm going to do is maybe kind of jump the gun, maybe start at like 6:25, because there was a buttload of questions on the forum. I think I have like 9 pages of questions, which is a lot. So I don't think Mike, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, if you watched the Tuesday webinar, I don't think Mike did any of the forum questions. I think he just said live Q&A. And if that's not correct, just let me know so I don't have to answer the same questions over and over again for you, so we can get to new stuff. But I don't think he did any of the forum questions from this last week. So I'll take those for today. And because there were so many, I think I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in, and that way we'll have time for live Q&A at the end. So I think we're up to 3 viewers, a whopping 3. Excellent. I know a lot of you guys watch the watch the replay, so that's totally fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump right in, and so we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, welcome. If this is your first or one of the first few webinars, Dr. James Hoffman here. I am in beautiful Monterey, California with my family, Dr. Melissa Davis, who I call Dr. Fiance, and my mom. So we're hanging out, and I'm glad that I was able to get this webinar going. Sorry that I missed you on Tuesday, and I'm trying to fulfill my weekly duty, so I made sure that we got this one going for today. So I apologize if this was at a time that was maybe less convenient for you, and hopefully we can get all your questions answered either live right here and now, or hopefully you can watch the replay and still get your questions answered. So welcome if this is your first couple times. Also, just be advised, I'm going to answer a bunch of questions that were from the forum. So if you are not familiar with this process, if you look on the homepage here, you can see there's a thing that says check out the questions I'm answering here tonight, and then a red hyperlink. Click that hyperlink, and that will open up the questions that I am answering right now. And I'm going to go from top to bottom. So folks, let's get started. All right. Katina Desjarnais asks, how much medium intensity steady state or low intensity steady state is too much during a cut phase? I'm currently in cut 2 following the female physique templates and about 5.5 weeks in on a cut phase, and just started adding low intensity steady state and medium intensity steady state last week. On the days where I do medium intensity steady state, I swim 1,000 meters, which takes me about a half hour. On days when I do low intensity, I've been doing 1 hour on the treadmill at an incline, averaging about 300 to 400 calories based on the machine calculation. For non-training days, which is twice per week, I've been doing 2 hours on the treadmill at the same calorie per hour rating. At the end of this, I plan on moving to cut 3 since the scale hasn't moved much since the beginning of the cut, making it hard to determine the progress. Start at 133, weight fluctuates between 129 and 131 with a low of the 128. With the addition of cut 3 for the remaining 6 weeks of this cut, I was curious if may be going a bit too heavy on the low intensity steady state or if I should dial it back. I recall one of the vlogs mentioning that Lori would do about 650 to 750 calories per day of low intensity steady state in preparation for a bodybuilding show. Okay, so this is a great question, one that we get all the time, kind of what's the deal with doing cardio on your cut, right? So usually we recommend really starting to ramp up the, whether it's low intensity or moderate intensity, or even just your NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis activities. Once you really start to have to constrict your calories to the point where it's really starting to get uncomfortable, right? Where really when you're starting to like be dying, getting really bad food cravings, really bad hunger, instead of continuing to constrict those calories more, we really start trying to ramp up either NEAT or the cardio. Now, into is that doing a lot of that cardio can potentially have some negative side effects on things like muscle mass and strength. But the good news is is that most of that is the effect size is very, very small, oftentimes like not even statistically different than a group that just does weight training. And you have to really do a shitload of low intensity cardio before it really becomes an issue. So the more technical way of answering this is when you start to notice that your weight training MRV is significantly reduced as a result of the amount of cardio that you're doing. Now, we always talk about MRV as a systemic process, right? Where we say, okay, I have MRV for all my training sources, and that should include cardio, right? But in the case of cutting, weight training is your muscle retaining activities, whereas cardio is a calorie burning activity, and that's great, but it doesn't help you retain any muscle. In fact, it has the potential to do the opposite. It has the potential to lose muscle in really, really high doses when things aren't good. So what we say is, there's not really a clear cut in terms of frequency or minutes per week or miles swam or ran. Can't really give you anything like that. But what I will tell you is if you get to the point where your MRV, especially for your legs, like if you can't deadlift and squat with the appropriate intensities or volumes that you used to do, even factoring in the restrictions of your diet with the cut, that's when you're kind of tipping overboard. Now, frankly, it's pretty hard to do that. And actually, I have actually achieved it, which is a borderline proud and shameful moment for myself. When I remember when I was cutting once, I actually was walking to failure. How pathetic is that? That's like the ultimate fat turd move where you literally are walking and you walk to the failure point where you can't walk anymore because my shin splints and calf cramping was so bad because I was so heavy. So that's pretty bad. But it can actually start to affect like your deadlifting. That's, for me, that was one of the big tells of me personally, was that my deadlifts really took a hit really, really bad. And I started to notice like all this extra fatigue from the diet and cardio on top of that, I'm really starting to take a big hit on some of my big lifts like squats and deadlifts. So the answer is there's not really a concrete number I can give. Once you start noticing that your MRV for your lifting starts going down in general, particularly your legs, that's going to be kind of the tipping point on the cardio. Now, the good news is even if you do take a hit, let's say you kind of still keep pushing through that, you can do that. The good news is once you switch over to maintenance, a lot of the performance decreases in either muscle mass or strength will actually rebound back up very quickly. So you can kind of ride it out for a little while. I wouldn't encourage you to do that more than maybe like 3 to 4 weeks. After that, you might start to see, I don't want to say semi-permanent, but you might take longer to rebound some of the damage that you have done. I don't even want to say damage, but it might just take a little while for you to get back to normal. Most of that is very, very much reversible. So Katina also said she's coming off a very successful 11 months with Dr. Melissa. So that's really awesome. She's a little bit nervous about venturing off on her own and making big girl diet decisions. Don't worry about it. You know what? What we usually say is keep constricting calories if you're not losing weight, obviously. Remove fats, keep removing fats until you kind of hit those minimal levels. Then start working on your carbs. And then eventually you're going to get to a point where you kind of cross over, where it's like, okay, I went from dieting and like kind of medium dieting, and now I've crossed over into like really uncomfortable and hard dieting. That's a time where you want to start thinking about ramping up the cardio because you're on a ticking time bomb. The fatigue and mental fatigue that you're going to generate from that point on is going to be brutal. So I usually recommend NEAT and cardio. And actually, I have a client, Raymond, who is doing a phenomenal job. I'm doing his diet right now. He kind of had a little bit of a stalemate in the beginning, but he really found strategies to start increasing his NEAT activities. And I think he started doing like MMA or kickboxing or something. And man, his weight started taking off again. And he did a really good job, and we didn't have to constrict a whole lot of food. So I think that's a really good example of what that should be used for. Just keep in mind, like there's a dose response with the cardio and the concurrent training side effects. So the more cardio you do, the more potential for negative concurrent training effects. But again, they're relatively small and mostly reversible once you switch over to maintenance. So good question. Let me know if I covered that okay. All right, next one. Thought up another question completely unrelated to the first one. Do plant-derived anabolic steroids like laxagenin and reptonicum carthamoides, I don't know if I said that right, actually work in human populations? You know what? I already read this one ahead of time. Unfortunately, I have no idea. I've never actually looked into this. My skeptical self would say probably not. Probably the mechanisms are between plants and humans are distinctly different enough where it's probably not even worth investigating. However, first we would want to see it demonstrated in mice and rats really, really profoundly. So I would say at this point, it's probably not worth your time in looking into. There could be something there. I personally would suspect that there is not something there. But then again, I'm more than willing to eat humble pie on that later on. So I would say, probably not much there, especially given that the anabolic steroids that are available, well, I don't want to say available, but the ones that you can get from your neighborhood GNC guy with the trench coat work really, really well. So if you're going to go that route, you might as well go and get the good stuff. Now, obviously, there are legal issues, so don't do anything dumb. But, I mean, if you're going to go the anabolic route, you might as well get the good stuff. I don't know. It seems kind of silly to take plant stuff. Unless you're Groot from Guardians of the Galaxy, then it might be a great option. So I would say, you know what, at least in my opinion, at the current time, probably not much there. But that is also ignorance on my part. So I actually don't know. I would just guess probably not. So hopefully we'll see more on that. At the current time, I don't have enough knowledge on that to comment. But good question. I appreciate it. All right, Randall Carter, great resource. Thanks for all you do. Hey, thanks for chiming in. We appreciate you guys' questions week to week. All right, first one. Oh, actually, he mentions that I actually answered this question in a previous webinar. Great, awesome, glad I got you. Okay, so we'll move on to a different question. With these goals in mind, 1,500 plus powerlifting total at 205, sub 14 2 mile on a fitness test, 80 push-ups and sit-ups in 2 minutes twice per year. What are your thoughts on the following macro cycle structure? Am I applying the principles fairly well? So it looks like we got 2 hypertrophy phases followed by 2 strength, followed by an endurance, and then we cycle back through another really, really long phase of hypertrophy, strength, and endurance. So the hypertrophy block would be something like 8 to 10, 65 to 75%, 1 rep max. Of course, you would do mass or cutting depending on where your body composition was. So strength block would be in the 3 to 6. So one thing real quick, sometimes it's actually good. So I like at face value, I like the way that you did that. When you have 2 strength blocks, one thing that I like to do is do a kind of a general strength and then a maximal strength. So instead of dropping all the way to 3 to 6, sometimes, like for example, if you're in the 8 to 10, dropping all the way to 3s is like an unbelievable shock. And it doesn't sound like that big of a drop, but actually like doing a group of like 4 to 8 for a mesocycle and then transitioning into maximal strength, like 1 to 3 later on, really, really smoothens that out and you get a ton out of it, which has been really helpful for me in programming for myself and for a lot of my clients. So I like the structure. I would say for the strength block, don't drop right into the 3 to 6 rep range. After the hypertrophy one, I would say do an intermediary general strength, which is usually around 4 to 8 reps. So kind of like 5s, 5s or 6s. And then you can transition into maximal strength, which would be sweet. I would actually consider maybe not doing low intensity cardio stuff during the strength block. I would maybe think about doing like kind of tempo or lactate style training where you're either working around your lactate threshold or really working on like your race pace. So still primarily anaerobic. You can do high intensity stuff. That's awesome. What I'm getting at is maybe don't do like true low intensity, like distance stuff. Maybe if you have HIIT intervals on one day, on a different day, you can do, like I said, like tempo training, lactate training, any of that would be really good. Maintenance diet, that's totally correct. And the endurance block, very low strength training, high volume of push-ups. Yeah, so the endurance block essentially is like the peaking block for your events. So, I would treat the endurance block as kind of like your peaking phase with different goals in mind, right? So for example, it would be a really poor idea to do the endurance block with the powerlifting goals in mind, but I would, unless you did a very specific peaking protocol for powerlifting, while on the other hand, doing the push-ups, like you said, the push-ups and the sit-ups, and then actually doing kind of like 2 mile, high intensity 2 mile or very close to that type activities with the maintenance diet is probably a really, really good idea. Now, if we go back and look at your original structure, the first one looks great where it says high pipe, strength, endurance. I like that. Now, how you set it up after that might be dependent on the needs analysis you have generated for yourself. Like what areas are you more severely lacking in? If your powerlifting totals are not quite where you want them to be, but your mile times, your push-ups, sit-ups, all that's good, then it might be worth your while to do a lot of hypertrophy work and really try and mass up so you can really benefit from that strength later on. However, if your powerlifting totals are right where you want them to be, you might actually consider taking one of those hypertrophy blocks out and then maybe even doing a prolonged strength or maybe even like 2 endurance phases. So either way is cool. I think the way that you did it looks great. With those changes in mind, and then kind of how you run the second half, I think should be dictated by your specific needs analysis, like what areas that you think you're really lacking in. So, but other than that, I think it looks good, man. Right on. You got the maintenance diet stuff down. Looks good to me. All right. Tony Drotno, one of our regulars. So, hey guys, first an interesting note before my question. I asked Brad Schoenfeld if he would hypothesize that low load training would likely lose efficacy relative to higher load training over time, and that much of its benefit is derived from its novelty as compared to said higher loads, which Mike has suggested in the past. Dr. Brad replied that he actually intuitively suspects that low load training will remain just as effective as heavier load training indefinitely, and the similarities we saw between the two modalities aren't merely as a result of study duration, but obviously we lack the direct evidence to say for certain. Given the long duration already studied, it certainly doesn't seem implausible to me. I tend to agree with Mike on this one. I think him and I are on the same wavelength on this. I think that the low load training is a perfectly fine way to train. But in my experience, and again, this is not, I don't want to pass this off as being true or science. In my experience, it does not seem to, it seems to plateau off relatively quickly. Some populations that seem to benefit from it a lot are those who are in rehabilitation. And I don't know if this is actually true or not, but what you see is some like really high level bodybuilders really start to adapt this style of training. And I really think that's not necessarily because it keeps working. I think that becomes more of a fatigue management issue later on because they're so muscled and so strong that really doing a lot of heavy training just becomes too crazy for them. And it just sucks and it blows. So they switched to the frankly easier stuff. Not to say that that's right or wrong. That's just what I suspect. I don't think that doing the low load training, very proximal to failure or metabolite style training will be beneficial indefinitely. Just in my experience with programming for myself and for my athletes, it does seem to kind of peter off relatively quickly. And I would argue probably within 1 or 2 mesocycles. So I think, high load training is almost always effective. It almost never stops being effective with reasonable periodization considerations. If you just do the same shit all the time, you're going to start to plateau off. Doesn't matter if it's high load or low load. But for the most part, we see like doing the heavyweight training still provides gains in strength and muscle mass over time. Seems to be really good. Low load also seems to be really good. However, I suspect that it is not as sustainable in terms of how long the effects will last. I could be wrong on that, and I'm willing to eat humble pie later on. But, we see evidence of that in the real world, particularly in bodybuilding, of that being true. Now, some people are successful in spite of doing the wrong things. We want to keep that in mind. So just because people are doing it doesn't mean it's true. But we can say like, hey, people are doing it. There does seem to be a trend in at least in the bodybuilding world that that lower load seems to be sustainable over the athlete lifespan. I would argue probably not. They could be doing better doing other things, but who knows? We'll see with hopefully some research will shine some light on that. For the moment, we can only speculate and go based on what we've done in the field. So, all right. My question pertains to the excellent London lectures, specifically Broderick's high-carb, low-fat diet. Yep. For both cuts and masses, keeping fats at minimum levels and filling the remainder total calories with carbs makes a lot of sense. However, should we stick with relatively low fats during the maintenance phase? Obviously, the standard RP diet approach would be great during maintenance, with carbs matched to activity levels and fats making up the difference. But are there potentially any benefits from adding back fats during maintenance? Conversely, are there any benefits to going full Kate Ann and staying in the minimal fats year round? Yeah, I would suspect just because your body systems all operate on dose response, and we see this in basically any biological system, any physiological system we want to talk about, there are dose response considerations, and we can start to see, desensitization effects from all sorts of things. So one of the first and immediate concerns, and this is also obviated by just kind of general health and like fatness and weight, is insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity. One of the things that what I would say is, one of the strategies that you want to continue making gains and retaining gains over time is to maintain a healthy insulin response. So that might be a potential benefit to backing off and really matching those carbs back down to activity levels during kind of maintenance and resensitization phases. Because if you're flopping calories a little bit around more than normal, so if you're swapping out as much fats for carbs as possible, you are generating a huge anabolic response, which is awesome. But one of the things I would say is there is a potential to start desensitizing that effect over time. So it might be good to kind of back off of that periodically, maybe not all the time. And the maintenance phase certainly would seem like the right time to do that. So it's a great thought. I don't think that staying at full K-an with minimum fats year round, I don't think it's easier said than done. The thing is, like, most people don't understand how hard eating that much carbohydrate actually is and how draining that can be. The nice thing about fats and calories is that they're really, really easy to put down. I mean, like, we have a couple people that I know personally who are doing the really, really crazy carb diet right now. And I mean, they have to eat upwards of 1,000 grams of carbohydrates per day. And if you're eating stuff like rice, like, oh my God, that's unbelievably difficult, right? So you also have to keep in mind, there's kind of like a psychological fatigue sustainability. And I would say, man, I think that's really, really tough. All the theoretical considerations for really reducing the fats and increasing the carbs is good for training, it's good for recovery. All of that is really good, but I still think there should be time to kind of emphasize, de-emphasize, just like we see with all other biological and physiological systems. So I think maintenance phase, probably a good idea to back down a little bit, increase the fats back up, especially if you've been undercutting the fats. So sometimes people kind of underdose their fats, either consciously or unconsciously, and that could potentially have a negative effect on some of your hormone levels. So it's good to have healthy fats back in the diet, and they're generally good for health if you're doing monounsaturated fats. So that's another good reason. Either way, I would say the downside would be the potential for developing more, I don't want to say insulin resistance like going diabetic, but just not having as powerful, as healthy of an insulin response from just the chronic blasting of high carbs all the time. We don't really know if that is completely confounded by muscularity and overfatness. It could be completely dependent on you just maintaining a reasonable body composition. That could be completely true. We don't know. So it's just for speculation, food for thought. So that would be my take on that. So it's a good question. I'm not sure. All right, Chase Safay, I love it. For those of you who haven't noticed, we love people with silly names. So if you have a silly name and you haven't asked a question yet, you better jump on it because I got something for you. All right, Chase Safay. Been wondering about the use of PEDs for weight class athletes. Would using anabolics like testosterone during a strength block and eating maintenance allow the athlete to remain in their weight class and make faster strength gains? Yes, absolutely. If so, would these strength gains be lost when the athlete went off the drugs? Yes. So we see kind of a semi-permanent effect with the use of anabolics. So when you start using them, your strength will go up. There's a kind of a delay, for depending, if there's some individual differences, but there will be a little bit of a delay. And then with continued use, you'll start to see strength going up even at maintenance level calories, which is a cool side effect. Unfortunately, that does over time when the athlete does start to come off of some of the drugs. Now, that effect is not completely lost. So it's not to say that they lost all of their strength, because a lot of strength is neurological. So they might actually retain some of that strength that they gained during their time of usage, but it should be expected that some of that will also be lost once they come off the drugs. So, for weight class sports, it would probably be more advantageous to stay on more often than not and kind of commit, rather than coming off and on. Then you're going to start to run into weird body weight issues. You're going to run into weird peaking issues for your competition, where you said, like, okay, well, my strength block, I was putting up, whatever, 300 kilos. And then now I've got USADA testing coming up and I got to come off my gear. And now I can't put up as much as I wanted during my meet because I came off, right? So there's lots of other different issues, but for sure, PEDs can help you gain strength, and at the very minimum, not lose strength under like hypocaloric conditions. So during a maintenance phase, you can certainly expect strength to escalate a little bit faster than normal, but that is kind of a semi-permanent effect where it will hang in there for a little bit, but generally once the drugs come out, the strength will slowly come back down over time, and that's pretty normal. All right, Hacker always has tons of great questions for us. Regarding hypertrophy programming, I know maxing out in a given rep range is a bad idea because it can limit the amount of quality volume one can present. Yep, that's true. What would you say is a good intensity limit to train in the context of one's maximum for a given rep range? So for example, 10 pounds below one's repetition maximum, 5 pounds below. You know, I think a lot of this can be ameliorated by using the reps in reserve or the from fail system. If you're looking at the relative intensity, generally I keep my programming for my athletes somewhere around what I estimate to be between about 80 to 95% of their set by rep max for whatever it is. So if I know that their best 4x10 is, you know, 100 pounds, I generally will keep less than 95 pounds. And an easy way to do that is by using the reps in reserve. And that ensures that you are not overstepping your boundaries of intensity. And that's a really easy way to do that. So yeah, for whatever set by rep that you're working with, I like to use the relative scale. And it's usually between like 80 and 90. So a typical progression that I like to use is somewhere starting around, depending on how many weeks. So, you know, if you're doing a 3-in-1, you might do something like 85, 90, upwards of 95 at the very top end. If you're doing a 4-in-1, it might be like 80, 85, 90, 95, or, you know, it doesn't have to be in increments of 5 either. It can be fractions. That's totally fine, but anything like that is totally great. And again, I think personally the reps in reserve is an easy way of ameliorating that problem, so you're not going up to, you know, your 10 rep max or your 4x10 RM on accident. So you always want to make sure, just leave a couple reps in the tank, and that's an easy way to do that. And that's usually like an overloading range would be somewhere around 80 to 95% of whatever set by rep RM that you're working on. Okay, tied to the question above, if one trains just below their 10 RM or 8 RM and gets a ton of volume in after deloading, with their original 10 RM or 8 RM go up? Potentially, but not always. Example for say bench press, current 10 RMs 230, accumulation goes something like 200, 210, 220, 225, deload at 185. That sounds great. Can they assume their new 10 RM will be 235? No, you cannot assume that. It is a logical thought, and if things are going well, it's very likely to be that. But it's not appropriate, especially when you're dealing with trained athletes, to assume that you will always see a tangible increase in strength like that. Ideally, yes. And for most people, yes. But you have to keep in mind, like when you start getting towards the butt end of your career, the amount of strength that you gained might not be super measurable, or at least measurable in that kind of increment. So more likely than not, yes, I think we can assume their new 10 RM would be 235, but that would be, you know, if we wanted to be really nitpicky, if you want to be a good sport and exercise scientist, that would be a no-no. We can't really say that. It's a logical thought. And I have done that, and it has came back and burned me every now and again. Now, how much can it really burn you if you're only off by 5 pounds and you're, you know, dealing with something in the 200s of pounds? Not much at all, right? But if you're being really, really nitpicky, then yes, it can. So it's hard to say. I think the hitting rep PRs for bodybuilding is a really, really great way of monitoring strength, and you should absolutely be shooting for that kind of stuff. So that should be absolutely be your goal. Like, what can I increase my 10 RM from on this phase? Does it always happen that way? Especially like if you're cutting or if you're on maintenance? Maybe not. It doesn't always happen. It's great when it does. So just keep that in mind, right? So like sometimes there's muscle mass issues, sometimes there's neurological issues, but more often than not, yes. To be really, really nitpicky, no. For an intermediate, when stringing together 3 hypertrophy mesos in a row coming off of 5-week maintenance, do you think it's a good idea for the first block to be a general focus and the next 2 blocks to each have 2 body parts that are being specialized, rather than specializing in all 3 blocks? Hold on, let me read that again. For intermediate, when stringing 3 mesos together coming off of maintenance, do you think it's a good idea for the first block to be general focus and the next? You can go right into your specialization if you want. I don't see there anything being wrong with that. Really, the 5-week maintenance really covers that generalization and resensitization for you. So you can kind of go right in. Usually, I would say probably you can, honestly, I don't think it matters a whole bunch. You could probably go either way. It kind of would depend on, I would say, your individual characteristics like fiber typing. So what you might find is that you respond really, really well to the higher rep ranges, which is fine and really, really good. So you might choose to specialize the last 2 hypertrophy mesocycles, which the second one is generally a higher rep one, and then the third one is usually like the metabolite or like low volume training. That might be a really good time to specialize. And you might do vice versa if you're a really, really fast switch, right? Where you might do the first two, like the first one's generally a little bit more intense than the latter two, and the second one's a little bit more in that middle ground. So you could kind of go either way. I don't think there's a huge disadvantage to doing either. I would say doing it sooner than later is probably a good in terms of benefiting from the resensitization phase that you did, because as you do 2 more hypertrophy mesocycles, you are potentially desensitizing that training response, so you might benefit less from specializing. So it might be good to do the first 2 specialized and then the last one more generalized. I don't know if there's a huge advantage or disadvantage, I mean, like in terms of tangible effect to either of those strategies. So if I was to make a guess, I would say probably specialize the first 2 and then you can generalize the third one if you want to, but I don't think it's a huge deal either way. Okay. Combat sport in addition to bodybuilding and strength training. Yes, my man. What kind of negative effects can one expect to see in the training? Will strength and size take a serious hit if one engages in combat sports, say twice per week? Can a lot more food mitigate these problems? I understand there will be performance decrements in bodybuilding, but if one takes care of their recovery, does there really need to be? Mike, you train BJJ all the time, and you seem to make awesome gains. Yeah, so one of the first things that you need to determine, or excuse me, you need to establish right off the bat, regardless, I mean, combat sports, this is more so true than a lot of other sports, but this is true for all sports. Your MRV for your bodybuilding and strength training will go down. It doesn't matter what sport you do. Now, if you do combat sport, generally what you find is that you have not only the extra fatigue of a different type of training stimulus, but generally those come with contact of some sort. Now, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you don't necessarily punch and kick people, and it's a good way to get disqualified, but you do get a lot of wear and tear on your joints, like your fingers, your wrists, your elbows, your ankles, your knees, all of the above, right? If you do something like Muay Thai and kickboxing, you are actually absorbing punches, kicks, elbows, and some throws. If you do things like judo and wrestling, you're certainly taking and receiving throws on the ground. So you have an decrease in MRV, if that makes sense, right? So your MRV goes down from adding other training sources. In this case, you have the extra fatiguing effects of combat and impact, which will be a little bit more wear and tear than, say, doing like tennis or golf. For example, and I know most of you who have followed us for a while have heard me say this before, and I apologize, but I'm going to use it again. I started doing Muay Thai, and I really love it as a supplement to my strength training since I'm just a professor at this point. And what I have found was if I'm doing Muay Thai, I cannot train my arms more than twice per week because the wear and tear on my elbows and my bicep tendon in particular becomes very, very profound and gets really, really sensitive. So I have to really limit down my arm training, and my leg training takes a slight hit. Not terrible, but it does take a hit. So it's a compromise. It's a trade-off. Can you be just as strong and just as muscular if you pick up a combat sport? No, you cannot. And that's okay because you are doing something else productive with your life, and that's perfectly fine. But if you want to be the best bodybuilder or strength athlete in the world, you got to let those things go for the time being. So, the first thing basically will be to kind of trial and error. Start going to your thing twice per week, and you will notice after the first 2 mesocycles that you might have to adjust your sets per week or the top end of your MRV for a lot of things, and that's perfectly fine. That's the first thing that will start working itself out. So just don't assume that you can do what you did before and then add combat sport on top of that. There's no way that that's going to happen. So all you got to do is just keep good, diligent notes on what you've been doing, and I know that you're somebody who already does that. And then you might have to tone down the top end of your MRV to accommodate that combat sport activity, and that's perfectly fine. It's also a really good idea during cut phases, and this is something that I've said a bunch of times. I'm going to say it again right now. Man, combat sport can't go wrong on a cut phase. It keeps you really, really active, burns a ton of calories, and it's generally not as degrading as doing kind of that repetitious, steady state type activity. A lot of it generally comes with high intensity activity, like Muay Thai, for example. Even Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you have bouts of high intensity activity interspersed with recovery rather than low intensity activity. So it's not a muscle gaining or retaining activity specifically, but it will help. It'll be less negative than doing kind of traditional steady state cardio, if that makes sense. Okay. Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Okay, if one is training a given body part between MV and MEV because it is not being prioritized during that block, Would the intensities being used and proximity to failure be higher because the volume is so much less than normal? No, that's actually a very good question. I like where you're going with that. But actually, the maintenance volume, assuming it's not like it's below 60%, covers you on that. Now, what you're thinking about is like the recommendations for tapering and stuff like that, and that's a very good train of thought. You do not have to do that. You can. So the short answer is the intensity and reps in reserve should be right on par with what you normally do. You don't have to make them differentially intense compared to the rest of your stuff because they're at maintenance volume. The maintenance volume assumes that you are at an appropriate overloading intensity, and therefore, if you're achieving the maintenance volume, you're good to go. So that's a great question, and I like your thought process, but you don't need to adjust the intensities. It's the same as the relative intensity for everything else that you're doing, assuming that doesn't go below about 60% of your 1 RM. So great thought. I like that one, Jimmy. All right, Kyle Lothar. For both of you, just me tonight, sorry, homie, has there ever been an idea or something fitness related that you thought would be a big deal only to turn out to be nothing? Yeah, man, that happens all the time. That's like basically what the fitness industry is. And when I was getting into fitness, I was like everybody else, man. I was like the suburban drug cartel guy who had a duffel bag full of supplements. Like, yo, man, I got what you need. What you need? You need that Tribulus. You need that creatine. You need that, whatever. That's part of like growing up and being a good scientist and being a good, just skeptical person, like trial and error and like seeing things and just being, most of you who are in fitness have seen so many things come and go and probably have bought into some of those things at some point in time. And that's okay. There's no shame in that. I can't tell you how many things have come and gone. I'm trying to think of, now that you're asking me, I'm trying to think of like a funny one off the top of my head. Oh, Dr. Mel's chiming in here.
Dr. Mike Isbell got super into lysine, and he had white powder over everything.
Yeah, perfect.
He was covered in it.
Dr. Fiance just chimed in, and one of the ones that we like to talk about is using leucine. So you guys know branched chain amino acids. Leucine is one of them, and the research on leucine was really, really awesome in the beginning. So they were giving it to rats, and rats were turning into like Hulk rats for no reason. They were just growing astronomically big and muscular, which is cool. And so we kind of assumed like, man, leucine's going to be the new thing. If we dump leucine all over everything that we do, we should be jacked out of our minds, right? And unfortunately, and this is something Mike and I both tried, we would take, and for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, leucine is an amino acid. It tastes fucking awful. It's like the most disgusting thing ever. It tastes like death. It tastes like you're eating dead bodies, like skeleton corpse, like ground up. It's terrible. And it doesn't mix into anything, right? You put it in the water and it just makes a big iceberg, and you shake it as hard as you can for like 10 minutes and it reforms the iceberg right in front of your face. It's terrible, awful. It's bitter. It's nasty. And human studies came out and they said, yeah, it doesn't really do diddly dick. So all that suffering for nothing, right? All that leucine that I've drank and bathed in for nothing, right? People were doing Coke lines of leucine because we thought it was going to be awesome. And that's just one example. There's so many other things that come and go. Man, I think the recovery stuff is another example of that, where we see stuff coming and going. I hope that cupping is an example of something like that. I obviously have a vendetta, personal bias. But I think that's something that we're going to see come and go, where people are like, oh yeah, cupping, or, what's the acupuncture, dry needling, all that stuff. That's all stuff that's going to come and go. We think that it does really, really awesome things, and then it generally does not. And what it really boils down to, and this is what you got to keep in mind, when people come to you with these cool training, these cool nutrition, these cool recovery things, one of the first things that you have to establish is that these are things that are generally trying to circumvent the things that matter the most, the things that are hardest, the things that nobody wants to do. You want to have a big ass and big muscular legs. Nobody wants to do 10 sets of squats twice per week, right? It sucks. It's painful. It's miserable. But you know what? There's no other way around it. You can get that dumbass little as seen on TV squat butt master thing. You can get the thigh master. You can do all sorts of dumb shit. Right? But at the end of the day, what's going to make your legs really, really strong, muscular? Well, lifting free weights, like doing squats, deadlifts, lunges, leg presses, things like that. There's no way around it, right? They're going to say, have you tried this crazy new diet or this new supplement, right? Really, what are the things that matter? Well, monitoring your calories, monitoring your macros, and doing a reasonable job on your nutrient timing is probably the most important things, right? There's no one supplement. There's no one recovery modality. There's no one training thing that's going to really be all that groundbreaking at this time until we start to get into genetic modification. That's going to blow all this shit out of the water, and RP Plus is going to go under, and I'm going to be out of a job, and I'm going to be a homeless guy out here in Monterey. So what you got to keep in mind is you should be skeptical, right? There's never going to be something that really is going to blow everything else out of the water here. And we see this all the time. And what you should be asking yourself is this particular thing trying to circumvent the things that matter the most? Are they trying to circumvent the things that are hard, right? Just if you ever hear something that says like, you'll never have to diet again, wrong. You'll never have to lift weights or do cardio again, wrong. You'll never have to sleep again. That's all stupid. It makes no sense. So, man, it's a great question, and I wish I could think of more examples off the top of my head. I just can't at the moment. But, man, this happens all the time. Shit comes and goes. So you should always be skeptical because, more often than not, it's crap. More often than not, it's always something dumb. The things that are actually good are few and far between, and they're usually just iterations on things that we already know to be successful, right? You know what I'm saying? So, hopefully I'll think of some more. Actually, I hope you guys post some funny crap. I haven't looked at the live feed because I'm still looking at the questions, but hopefully by the time I look at it, you guys have posted some really funny ones. All right. You have Jenny Rashai, always has great questions. Okay, so from last week, he wanted to clarify his lumbar recovery related question during last week's Q&A. By recovery, I meant doing a unilateral exercise with accentuated eccentric component for the particular area or muscle in my lumbar region that's been bothering me. I tried it in the past, and it really made a difference in terms of the degree of discomfort. So I'm doing hypertrophy style eccentric focused work with reps twice a week, 16 to 18 reps. And that's why it's whether to put in high volume phase, but the risk adding jump volume, or to do it during the maintenance low volume phases, or I have more wiggle room. I see what you're saying. So you're just kind of weighing whether or not you want to pump out a lot of volume on that, potentially not growing a lot of muscle, adding on fatigue. I think it's okay. It depends on if you think you're really getting a lot out of it. Excuse me. If you find that doing the EAL, eccentric accentuated loading stuff, is helpful for you, I'm not going to tell you not to do it because it probably is doing something worthwhile. It's not something that's totally outlandish. It's not something like outside of the realms of the scientific principles. Generally doing it falls into that metabolite style area. So unless you're doing it really, really close to failure or with like constricted rest protocols or Katsu style, you might not be getting a ton out of that, and that's okay. But, like you said, it seems to make a difference in terms of the discomfort. I would say don't pump a lot of effort and a lot of volume into it, which it doesn't sound like you are. And if it makes you feel good, that's probably not a big deal. I don't see it being a huge thing. Okay. Maintenance and exercises with accentuated eccentric component. I noticed that on the maintenance phase, because of the higher loads, I sometimes start feeling a slight discomfort, not pain, in previously injured areas. I also noticed that slow eccentrics almost never re-aggravate those areas. Is using exercises with accentuated eccentric component a viable option for a resensitization meso? So here's the problem that you run into. Those nagging injuries are going to resurface during the maintenance resensitization phase. Why? Because the intensity is higher during those times. So whenever you start actually moving into that strength range is typically when nagging injuries are going to start kind of rearing their ugly heads again. And that's consistent across the board. So the higher the intensity of the exercise, the more likely those nagging injuries are to start re-expressing themselves. Now, there's nothing wrong with eccentric accentuated loading. I think it's a fine intensification technique, so that's totally cool. However, the resensitization phase is there to start reducing fatigue. The problem that I have with doing it during the resensitization phase is that EAL style loading is inherently brutal. It inflicts a ton of structural damage to the muscle. Now, sometimes, like you said, you don't get quite as sore, but that's probably because you're not using loads that you normally could do for that strength range, which might actually make you sore. So typically, like if you don't get DOMS from it, it's because you're using lighter loads or any number of other reasons. But if it's not causing you pain, that's fine. What my point being this, the resensitization phase is meant to lower the volumes down to maintenance volumes and really start to help kind of a total systemic healing recovery effect in the body and in the mind. So I think that's probably maybe not a great strategy unless you're dealing with injury. And in that case, and it sounds like that might be a viable option, but it does inflict a lot of trauma on the area. So I have had a hard time programming EAL in an effective way. I've seen it used during hypertrophy phases, and then it ends up being too brutal. I've seen it used in like maintenance phases, strength phases, and then you don't get as much strength out of it because you can't use the loads that are appropriate for the strength phase, right? So it's one of those, like, unless you're doing it where you are if you're doing the hyper loading where you're actually loading above your concentric ability, and I've seen that done, that could be potentially beneficial, but then again, the nervous system fatigue from that is gigantic. So I've had a hard time programming those in like a hypertrophy program or a sports program outside of rehabilitation. And I know that people have advocated for those for rehabilitation, and you seem to be having success basically in the same scenario. So I think it's fine. I would say generally that might not be the best strategy to use during a maintenance phase. I would say EAL probably best reserved for cutting massing phases. And actually, I've actually seen Dr. Mike use EAL very, very wisely to keep his volume loads really, really high during cut phases when he was in the hole. I mean, like, he was just dieted down so hard that he was having a really hard time maintaining his intensity during some of his leg sessions because he's such a strong squatter. So he started using like 4-second eccentrics and EALs on some movements to really keep that volume high without really increasing like the fatigue and risk of injury from using those super, super intense loads. So I think that's a perfectly fine way to do it. I would reserve that for cutting and massing phases. I personally haven't used them with a super ton of success, but I think that they're still valuable, and I think it's a perfectly good way to train. Probably not during the maintenance. I would say save it for cutting and massing. Excuse me. Related to mini cutting, you have no idea how much shock I experienced when the realization of being able to train at MEV and not losing muscle finally set in. So F you, bro, for not writing about this earlier, because that would save me from so much rectal discomfort. Bro, what are you doing? My question is, can one go straight into the 1% weight loss value on week 1 and just stick with it for the rest of the mini cut, or doing some kind of progression, 8 tenths, 9 tenths, 1%, 1.1% have some advantage? You know, I think there might be an advantage to kind of ramping up a little bit more aggressively as you go, but I don't know if that's true at all. I think you can jump right into the 1% and ride it out very, very comfortably. There might be a benefit into kind of easing it in, but I think that's probably more important for people who are beginners and not used to the process. I think if you kind of know the routine, and I know you know the routine because you ask so many good questions, you know the drill, you know what to expect, you know what your training numbers are going to be like, you know what your calories are going to be like, you can jump right in. And I don't think you have to have like those tapered style of weight loss goals. And I think that's really hard to measure at that point too, like differentiating 0.8, 0.9, 1.1, 1. I think it's going to be really difficult to measure as well. So that might be a limitation for that. MEV for traps on mini cut. Ooh, this is a good question. In the hypertrophy guide, it said most intermediates can make great trap gains with no direct trap work, as deadlifting, rowing, and side rear delt training is going to be very stimulative of the traps. Oh, there's a typo in there. Oops, it happens. We actually, on the volume book, we've done a much more diligent job. We've had people editing the grammar, which, no surprise, Mike and I are not super studs in the English department, and it's better for him because English is a second language. I have no excuse, right? I'm just a freaking derpy hillbilly. But we've done a really better job with having Mel and Mike's sister Sonia, who are excellent writers, really edit the book. So hopefully we'll have less typos and much more grammatically correct. So basically the question is, no direct trap works needed for a mini cut? No. If you mean by doing like specific like shrugs and like scapular stuff, no, absolutely not. You can, MEV is generally going to be hit for doing those deadlifts, even straight leg deadlifts to some extent, and any of your just general back work. So you really don't have to do a lot. Now, if you want to have like the biggest traps, and you do have the biggest traps in the world, it might be worth doing some direct trap work. However, in terms of actually just hitting an MEV for an intermediate, yeah, that's 100% true. I agree with that. You can get away with just doing rows. You know, as long as you're making a really good effort to not just oof the weight up and not just using your arms and flaring out really, really crazy on things like rows. If you're getting a really, really conscious protraction and retraction of your scapula on a lot of those movements, you're golden, man. You don't have to do a lot of stuff. And the cool thing is that saves you a lot of systemic fatigue because you might not think of it this way, but doing shrugs, like most people can shrug quite a bit of weight because it's such a small range of motion, but you actually have to stand there and hold that weight for however many reps you're doing. And standing presents a standing with that external load, very much like deadlifting, presents a very, very systemic fatigue from the nervous system. So it actually saves you quite a bit of effort and potential training volume that you could do by not doing it. So I think, for traps, you can mostly neg that kind of stuff. If you're an advanced athlete and you have really, really big back that you're trying to either grow or preserve, you might have to do some more direct trap work, but that's for advanced athletes. For intermediates, your boy included here, yeah, you don't need to do a ton, if any. Mini cuts, an alternative means of progression. From the previous Q&A, I understood that the intensity progression on a mini cut will be enough to maintain muscle. However, what if because of fatigue, one no longer can add weight? Is adding reps or even a set to be a reasonable strategy? Yes, absolutely. Also, dumbbell work. Considering most dumbbells that people use have 2 kilogram increments, then it is unlikely one can add 4 kilograms per week. Yeah, so a couple things. If you can't add weight, you might have started a little too aggressively, and that's okay. If you're just dealing with it, an easy way of doing it is increasing the reps in reserve. So if you were 3 from fail, move up to 2 or 1 from fail, that's fine. And then just maybe squeak out a few more reps. Ideally, you don't want to add sets if possible because the idea is to resensitize. And the mini cut's kind of in that gray area where you're not doing true maintenance, but you're still trying to resensitize, right? So I wouldn't add sets if you can avoid it. What I would do is add reps in reserve. And that might, that usually manifests like a week-to-week progression. If you did 877 on a weight and you were like, oh man, like there's no way I can go up in weight. I only got 877. I was supposed to be doing 8 to 12, right? The next time you do that, it's very common to see people get like 10-9-9 or like 10-9-8 and just go up a little bit in those reps. And that's perfectly fine. So I would say try and shoot for a few more reps, increase your reps in reserve. Dumbbell work. Yeah, it's a pain in the ass because sometimes you can't get a good increment, and that 5 pound or 2.5 kilogram jump can be devastating in terms of rep ranges. Sometimes you can get the little magnets, which are really cool. They come in like half or 1 pound or like half kilo increments, and they're just a little magnet that you can pop right on there. But not all gyms have those. If you can use those are sweet, and you can get those finite dumbbell increments. If not, like I said, use the same weight, increase your reps in reserve for the mini cut. I would try not to add sets only because the idea of that mini cut is to help resensitize for further subsequent mesocycles, right? So maybe don't add sets, but increase the reps in reserve is a really easy way to do that. Okay. If one gets a light injury in the middle of a meso and light type work is needed in order for that particular muscle to heal, how many light sessions or weeks of light sessions can be done on a cut, maintenance, or mass phase until muscle loss becomes an issue? Good question. Hold on. So if you're dealing with some type of injury and it's not a huge deal, usually the first thing you want to do is move into pain-free. So basically, you move into maintenance volumes for that stuff by just doing other stuff. So for example, if you pulled your hamstring a little bit, can you get by without doing ham curls, straight leg deadlifts, good mornings? Can you just do like squats and maybe lunges and will you be just fine? Yeah, right. Those will basically cover the MV for the most part for a little while. Once you can kind of start increasing your activities and moving on. So let's say the first strategy was pain-free only. So hamstring was hurt. I can squat, I can leg press, I can lunge, but direct hamstring work like deadlifts, straight leg deadlifts, good mornings, ham curls, back raises, those are out, right? Do the pain-free stuff as long as you can. The next mesocycle, move into light work, where you can start trying to work up to a modified MEV for some of those things. And that MEV will be modified because you will be limited as to how much you can actually do. So again, working through mostly pain-free at this point, like a little discomfort's okay, but mostly pain-free. You want to start adding in like good mornings, glute ham raises, something like that. Or I would start really easy, like a hamstring curl. Something like that, just to get some training volume in there and not risk any further detraining. Usually you can do that for a couple mesocycles, no big deal, right? I wouldn't go more than 1 to 2 of just using the other lifts to achieve maintenance volumes. The reason being is if you've ever done that before, you know how brutal it is when you switch back to training those muscles again. For example, hamstrings is a really good example. If you've ever had to take time off of doing hamstring training because of a hamstring injury, you know that the moment you go back, the first session, you get a horrible cramps, and then you can't crap for like a week because you can't sit down, even if you just do like 1 or 2 sets. So it's a good idea when you're dealing with the immediate injury to just use the maintenance volumes from doing your other lifts. But basically, as soon as you can operate kind of in that pain-free range, move up to an MEV of doing some of that lighter stuff. That's a good time to use like unilateral stuff or machine stuff because it's not super brutal and it's pretty easy to control for the most part because the loads are really light or on a fixed range of motion. It's a really good way. And you could do that for a couple mesocycles working up, and hopefully by then it should be mostly recovered. And if not, you probably have bigger problems and you might actually want to go see an AT or PT, right? If it doesn't resolve itself within like 2 mesocycles, 2 or 3 mesocycles, you might actually have a more serious problem than you thought. So what I would say is, like 1 mesocycle is probably okay of just doing maintenance volumes by using your other lifts that you're doing. 1 or 2 mesocycles of doing light training. And then after that, you should be able to move into your normal MEVs and AVs. And if not, it's at that point you want to go see like a specialist, like a physical therapist or an athletic trainer or something like that. Okay. Last time you touched on the topic of metformin. I understand that the doses used for life extension, potential athletic enhancement are not nearly as high as if dealing with diabetics. Do you personally know any recreational lifters using metformin and not having side effects? You know what? Unfortunately, this is not my area of expertise. Evgeny, and I apologize. You know what? Repost that one for next time when I'm back in town with Mike, and let's see if he has any insight. Unfortunately, I'm just not well versed in metformin, and I don't want to tell you the wrong thing, so I'm going to reserve that for later. Dark side, special sports supplements. You guys know what that means, right? Have you guys thought about using them in an intelligent manner at some point in your sport career? Yeah, we've always thought about using them. The thing is, right, do they enhance sport performance? Yes, absolutely, hands down, no question. The issue becomes an ethical issue. I think most of you guys who are in RP Plus and in the fitness industry probably, and I don't want to speak for anybody, but I think most of us don't really seem to have a moral issue with it. Like we see a lot of people using it. It's there. It's out in the real world. A lot more people are using it than we realize. It's not like a right or wrong thing, but there are ethical issues where it's like, okay, in my sport, so when I was playing rugby, USA Rugby says you can't do that, right? And so I think like you need to honor the rules and regulations. You need to honor the law. The law says, unless you have a prescription, you shouldn't be doing that. And so for me, it's an ethical issue. Of course, we've all thought about using them in a systematic way. And would that be beneficial? Absolutely, 100%. I would love to see MMA fighters juiced to the gills and ripping each other's arms off and beating them with it. But that's just not how it works, right? Because the United States government does not allow for that, nor does the governing bodies of MMA, at least for the most part. The UFC likes to say that they don't let people use drugs, but then they like to let them back in afterwards, after it's died down, like John Jones. Let's see what happens with John Jones. You think he's going to be back again? I bet you he will. So we'll see. But yeah, I would say it's an ethical issue. So I feel like if the rules and regulations say you're not supposed to, then you're not supposed to, right? Does it mean like other people will say like, well, everyone else is doing it, right? Like, so what? Everyone else is doing it. Well, yeah, but so what? You can only control yourself. I think if you consider yourself like an honorable, respectful, and good person, in order to look yourself in the mirror and say like, I'm a good person, you should say like, I competed under the rules, regardless of what everyone else did. I could only control myself, my behavior. I followed the rules. So, of course, we've all thought about it, but there are, there's big constrictions on that. And then for some people, and, Mike and I have talked about this before, it's not just like a matter of popping a few pills here or there. I mean, for a lot of people, that means a commitment to using drugs in the long term, and that can have fertility issues for men. It could mean having to do, TRT at some point. Like, there's a lot more that goes into it. So I would say you really want to get with somebody who you trust, who has at least a reasonable scientific background on the matter. And if you're going to choose to go that route, you definitely want to do it under supervision of a physician. There's a lot of stuff that can potentially go wrong if you're not using and dosing properly. So, just be smart. Are they going to help you be awesome at sport? Yes. My first thing would say, what does your sport say? Is your sport tested or non-tested? If it's a non-tested sport, then, go for it, right? Just don't get caught with the government and the police. Then you get in trouble. If it's a tested sport, don't do it. It's not part of the rules, and it's a dishonorable thing to do. That would be my opinion. Okay. Jeff Willis. I have 2 questions about the metabolite phase and the male physique templates. Is cutting appropriate in this phase? Yeah, absolutely. I'll be cutting for the next 6+ months, except for resensitization phases for maintenance. Yeah, you don't want to do that the whole time. And that's actually, I believe Tony was asking about that earlier in the webinar here. You would still want to have higher intensity, kind of more traditional 8 to 12, 8 to 15 kind of repetition phases in there. And then you can certainly use the metabolite phases within some of those macrocycle progression, but you don't want to necessarily train like that all the time. But yes, it's totally fine for cutting. Should people training for general fitness or sports performance be using a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio of hypertrophy, metabolite, resensitization for those phases? I think it's a perfectly fine, good way to train. That's the way that we did it for the male physique templates, and we think that people can be very, very successful. Does it mean that you can't do even blow it out even more, like 2 hypertrophies, a metabolite, and a resensitization? You can absolutely do that. A lot of it comes down to like what individuals can tolerate. The way that this is set up is what we think is pretty uniformly tolerable for most intermediate males, right? The hypertrophy, metabolite, resensitization can't really go wrong. A lot of people can't grind out 3, particularly males, can't grind out 3 mesocycles in a row and still be productive or still maintain a reasonable amount of fatigue. It just gets too hard. So some people can. So that's where some individual differences go in there. But to answer your question, yeah, man, that's an absolutely fine way to train for fitness. Now, for sports performance, we would not follow that at all. In fact, for not even do metabolite phases for you're in and you're individual. That might actually be potentially negative. So if you're interested in how we would do that for sport training, go ahead and load up my, I have a whole strength and conditioning course on RP Plus. If you go under the videos and courses section, there's a whole bunch of stuff on periodization for sport. Check that out. And if you have questions on that, I'd be glad to answer on next week's webinar stuff on that. But for fitness and for like bodybuilding kind of stuff, that works just fine, but there's still plenty of wiggle room for variations on that. Okay, Brian Delgado, is it optimal to periodize frequency? For example, if you're trying to place an emphasis on strong points, biceps, for example, while moving from moderate volume, high volume, and highest volumes throughout the course of a macro cycle, would it make sense to do meso 1, biceps twice per week, meso 2, 3 times per week, and meso 3, 4 times per week? Absolutely do that. So that's really just it's not, you could call it periodization frequency. I think it's more of an issue of like emphasis, de-emphasis. So you're emphasizing something at the cost of something else. And it's probably a pretty good idea if you want to make specific gains in some area. Do you need to do that to make overall net gains? No, absolutely not. It's not necessary. But if you are trying to add a significant amount of strength or muscle mass in a specific area, it's probably a pretty good idea, in fact, to actually periodize the frequency of some of that or emphasize some of those body parts a little bit more than others. I actually am doing that right now. As I said, like when I do kickboxing, I can't train my arms that much. I've been in a low volume phase for kickboxing, and I've actually increased my arm training, and I did an arm emphasis mass, and I gained a bunch of muscle in my arms, which isn't to say much because I look like Gumby. Anyways, in regards to your recent post on bringing up delts and using total reps for volume instead of sets, was your entire side rear delt split? I'm going to leave that one. I'll leave that one up to Mike. You know what, buddy? If you want to repost that one for Mike, I know that's probably what you're asking. That's totally fine, and we'll probably get to it on Tuesday. So just go back in the forum and say, hey, I had a question for you, Mike, and then you can, put FU James or something in there. Thanks a lot. Anyways, no, I'm just kidding. Repost that one, and we'll see if Mike will answer it specifically for you. No big deal. Okay, Isaba Areola. I'm just kidding. All right, guys. Which percent increase in volume from week to week would be recommended when using giant sets for a metabolite meso? Let's say I'm doing 50 total reps in week 1 for lat pull downs. How many should I do in week 2? 55, 60, 65. It's not like a specific number I can give you. There's not a right or wrong answer to that. Generally, the way that I do that is kind of somewhere in the ballpark of what would have been another set if I was doing a comparable rep range. So for example, let's say I was doing hypertrophy, which is a reasonable assumption here, right? I would say I would want to go from, if I did 50, probably somewhere around 56 to 60, because that would put me somewhere around 6 to 10 reps, which is right kind of in that hypertrophy range. That would be a win, right? So I think probably somewhere between 10 and 20% of an increase. That might not always be true, but basically the way I like to think of it, and this is maybe more of an intuitive way is like, what would have been equivalent for adding a set? So if I went from 50 to 52, that's like within the variation of what I can do on any given day. Like maybe I just had a bad day and I had a better day and I got more reps, right? So for me, it's like, it's got to be distinct enough where it's similar to if I did, instead of 5 by 10, I did 6 by 10, right? So it doesn't mean it has to be a 10 rep increase, but for whatever rep range that I'm working in, if I'm doing 5s, that would mean probably a 5 rep increase for the giant set. If I'm doing hypertrophy like 8 to 10, probably somewhere around like 10 reps-ish. Does it always have to be that way? No, absolutely not. And it's a great alternative progression. So I would say be intuitive about it. So I would say, probably, less than 5 reps is probably not enough. I would say probably between like 5 and 10 reps is pretty solid. And that's pretty equivalent across the board for like adding another set. So good question. What are your thoughts on isolation exercises for back development? I purchased your male physique templates and I've seen chest isolation exercises are included, flies, pec deck, but there aren't any for back, like pullovers. We just don't find them to be as useful. The pull-ups, pull-downs, and row variations are so effective. And like lat pull-downs are really, really meh. The technique on it, a lot of people do a really poor job on it. And we just don't find it to be all that great. But like you can't go wrong with doing rows, pull-downs, pull-ups. And like we said before, a lot of that can even hit maintenance volumes for things like traps. Like you don't even have to train your traps if you're doing some of that stuff already. You might even get an MEV out of it, which is awesome. So, we just don't do it a lot. Whereas like pec isolation seems to have a massive benefit. Like if you've ever done really, really deep dumbbell flies before, you get crazy soreness in the pecs, which is probably indicative that it's probably a really, really good movement. So it's hard to get like really, really good stretch like eccentric actions on some of that back work outside of like doing like rows and like eccentric accentuated lat pull downs. There's not a lot of isolation stuff where you can get a really good stretch and use a really reasonable load. I don't know. We just haven't really found it to be as successful as using pec isolation. So a lot of compound presses work just fine, but we find that doing isolation for the chest works really well. For back, we find that compounds they just take such a high beating in terms of volume load that doing a lot of isolations just don't seem to overload it to the degree that is necessary to either gain or maintain muscle mass. Is there any scientific evidence suggesting that creatine may lead to hair loss? Not that I'm aware of. Is that a new thing? I kind of have stopped looking at the creatine stuff for a long time just because it's kind of been there, done that for a while now. Honestly, I'm not sure about it. I haven't seen anything on that, but maybe I can look into it and see. But at the current time, I don't think there is, unless I'm missing something. Caleb Gammon. Hey guys, first of all, thanks for these webinars. I learned so much from them. You are welcome. Thanks for posting and asking questions. Two-part question. What changes to the cutting diet template need to be made from gymnastics training, if any? I use weights, bands frequently, as well as just get to the volume I need for hypertrophy, as most of the exercise progressions I need to do are strength, maximal strength. So if the question is, if I'm adding gymnastics training to what I normally do you need to change the diet template? No, not really. You're still going to follow the same guidelines in terms of monitoring your weight loss or weight gain. For example, if you're trying to gain muscle mass and you notice that like after you added gymnastics training, you're not gaining weight anymore, that's just because your energy expenditure went up. You're doing more training, right? So you just need to add more calories at that point. And if you're using the diet template, you might need to go on to like mass 2 or mass 3 or whatever, and that's totally fine. But otherwise, the process is exactly the same, and the same is for weight loss. If you're losing weight too fast, like if you're losing more than 2% per week consistently, you might actually backtrack a little bit and be like, man, this extra energy expenditure is putting me in the red in terms of weight loss. So I might be losing muscle, so maybe I need to back off a little bit. But other than that, nothing different. Is there a secret to prioritizing training where there are multiple progressions needed to perform a movement rather than simply adding weight to a bar? I'm trying to make sure I'm making progress when concentrating on hypertrophy mesocycle for a sport where strength is the name of the game, and there are so many progressions needed to get through. I'm just maybe not entirely sure what you're asking. Multiple progressions in terms of fitness characteristics, or are you talking about movement characteristics or like learning a sports skill? I'd be super glad to answer that question, and I think it sounds really interesting. I'm just not entirely sure. So if you're listening, post it on the live thread, and if not, repost it, rephrase the question for me, and I'll be glad to answer. Sorry I couldn't answer that at face value, and I will try next time. All right, Dusan Long, 2 questions for me. How should I train during mini cut? how to put mini-cut into a macrocycle. You know what? There was a whole bunch. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to dismiss your question. We answered a couple of this style questions on some of the previous webinars. So I think on the last 2 or 3, we did a lot of stuff on the mini-cut. I think go ahead and check that out. And check out Mike's Facebook page. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be dismissive, but we already kind of touched on that a few times. So check that out. Your thoughts on joint support supplements, glucosamine, collagen, chondroitin, MSM. I think it's mostly a waste of money. I tried using them personally. The research doesn't seem to show that they really do much outside of maybe placebo or some very, very mild, very mild effects. I think it's mostly a waste of money. I would go, and if you're having joint issues, you want to deal with your doctor or your physical therapist first, and then see what they say. But I think most of that's just garbage, frankly. Maybe I'm wrong, but in my experience and what I've read on them, there's not much there. All right, Andrew DeCisa. Hi, 1-1 exclamation point. Hey, buddy. How much of a detriment is it to cutting during deload week? It's not great. I know it's more optimal to be at least at maintenance for better recovery, but I'm thinking ahead to the following situation. I had planned 4-week mini cut following a deload at a maintenance for a week before starting massing. But if I'm not satisfied with the fat loss come week 4, can I extend the mini cut to a 5th week and run it into the deload? My worry would be I wouldn't be as recovered enough to jump into the following massing higher volumes, but I'm not sure. If you're going into massing, it's probably not a huge deal. Whatever potential negatives you drew from doing that will probably be quickly ameliorated when you switch over to massing. I still don't think it's a great strategy. I always advocate not to cut during your deload week because you are essentially still at maintenance volumes. And if you are in a hypocaloric state at maintenance volumes, you're not doing yourself any favors in terms of maintaining strength and muscle mass. So I wouldn't do it, but if you're really tied, like you're like, man, I need to hit 180 or I'm going to lose everything. My wife's going to leave me and my dog's going to like marry a cat or some weird shit. I don't know. If you're really, really tied to the number and you just want to see 180, on the scale, that's fine. And if you're switching to mass, any of that extra fatigue that you generated or have not recovered from will kind of work itself out. But you can expect to not have a good first couple microcycles in that session. So I would say try not to do that if you can. Okay. Recently, webinar recommendations for training during mini-cut have been train at MEV straight through the meso. Would that still count during resensitization phase? Resensitization phase is treated as normal. You don't do anything different because it was a mini-cut. So maintenance volume is needed to resensitize. Depends on what you're doing. So if you're just doing maintenance, if you're just doing a mini-cut, you can use MEV. If you try and train the mini cut at maintenance volume, you just won't get anywhere. You won't be expending any energy, so you won't lose weight. It's just kind of a wash. So we say go up to MEV as kind of the gray area between like a full resensitization and resensitizing the process just on a more general level. But yeah, to really fully resensitize, you need to drop down to maintenance volumes. You can use MEVs during the mini cuts to kind of get a bridged effect. Okay, if not, would progressing from MV to MEV be an effective way to resensitize during the mini cut? Yeah, you can do that. I think probably a better strategy instead of losing, because basically, in that between MV and MEV is that nothing zone. You're not making any progress. You're not making any tangible progress. So the question then becomes like, well, why are you doing that? So, use the maintenance volumes to resensitize. If you're going to do a mini cut, we say go to MEV just so that you are making tangible progress and at least generating enough exercise to start losing weight. So that's a good idea. So, I'd say go back and read Mike's stuff on that and see what in the previous webinar when we talked about it a little bit before. Okay. Last couple here. After watching the London lectures and all these questions on mini cuts, I've been wondering if you guys no longer recommend 3 mesos of consecutive massing, I think. Judging off the male physique templates and the above sources, you look like you now prefer 2 mesos followed by mini cut resensitization. Is this the case for most situations? I think 2 and a resensitization is really good in terms of reaping a lot of gains and not gaining a lot of excess fat, which will start to slow your gains down in that 3rd mesocycle and will require more time spent cutting. So ideally, you really want to maintain I don't want to say lean, but like a fairly lean body composition throughout your mass phase to potentiate gains and to make sure that you're not spending tons of time cutting later on. So, for the most part, what we have found is that even for massing, generally the leaner, the better. If you get really over fat during the time, which your boy here is guilty of, it just means you're going to have to spend a lot more time cutting and potentially losing muscle later on. So, there are some individual variations in that. So you have some people who can go more than 4 months and continue making productive gains in muscle mass, but that's not everybody. So we say, like the two mass phases and then a resensitization phase, or possibly doing a mini cut seem to be really, really good strategies for the time being. I appreciate your time to answer questions on Thursday, but since there's a football game during Q&A, I have to ask, are you a communist? Do you hate America? I'm having second thoughts about my RP Plus membership. Yeah, I think that was for Mike's, but Dr. Mel is over there laughing in the corner. Of course not. He certainly not me. And Mike's the most anti-communist person I've ever met, though he loves talking about it. All right, I'm going to refresh and just see if there's any live feed questions. All right, Tony's here, Penny's here. Oh God, Tony's talking about leucine. Dude, it was so nasty. It was so gnarly. He does HMB tasted worse. I hope I hopped on the HMB train big time, and no amount of orange Gatorade or great BCAAs could cover up a mere 2 grams of HMB, or the Shanker bottle would stink to high hell across the gym. Yeah, man, that sucks. That stuff's so freaking nasty, and it's like all that suffering for nothing. All right, guys. Doesn't look like there's any questions on the live feed. Hopefully I got to all the questions on the webinar. If I didn't get to your question, please feel free to post it in the forum, and I'll try to hit you again on Tuesday when I'm back in town with Mike. And for some of you who I said, please reserve your question for next time, repost it. I'll post it again, and we'll have Mike take a crack at it because I think some of you guys had some specific questions for him. All right. Thanks for joining me on a kind of unusual day and time. I appreciate your guys' question, and I am taking off for tonight. Have a great night and a great rest of the weekend on RP Plus. See you later.